The morning fog hung thick over the Sierra Nevada mountains as Rachel Davis stepped off the transport truck at Firebase Echo. Her oversized windbreaker flapped in the mountain breeze, making her already small frame look even tinier against the backdrop of towering peaks. At 24, she carried herself with quiet efficiency, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her eyes constantly observing everything around her. "Another tech transfer," muttered Sergeant Thompson, glancing at her paperwork without much interest. "Heavy weapons support logistics." "Great. Another pencil pusher who thinks she knows rifles." Rachel said nothing as she shouldered her single duffel bag. She'd learned long ago that corrections rarely changed first impressions and first impressions. At military bases were everything. Her transfer papers read exactly what they were supposed to read. Former technical assistants seeking specialized training. What they didn't mention was the 3 years she'd spent working alongside some of the military's most elite snipers at a classified northern facility. The Firebase buzzed with activity. Advanced marksmanship training was serious business here, and the instructors carried themselves with the swagger of men who'd seen real combat. Chief Instructor Martinez, a weathered veteran with 30 years under his belt, barely looked up when Thompson introduced her. "Put her with equipment maintenance," Martinez said dismissively. "Let her clean rifles and check inventory. Maybe she'll learn something useful watching the real shooters work." Rachel nodded politely, filing away the casual dismissal. She'd heard it before. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely 120 pounds, she didn't fit anyone's idea of what a marksman should look like. The military had heightened physical standards for sniper designation, standards she'd never meet. But expertise didn't disappear just because regulations couldn't recognize it. Her assigned quarters were Spartan basic bunk, single desk, metal locker, while other trainees decorated their spaces with photos and personal items. Rachel unpacked technical manuals about ballistics, atmospheric conditions, and advanced rifle mechanics. These weren't standard issue books. They were specialized texts most snipers never saw, filled with margin notes in her precise handwriting. "You planning to become a professor or something?" asked Marcus Webb, her bunkmate, eyeing the stack of books. Marcus was everything Rachel wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, confident, and loud. He'd arrived with stories about his previous base and dreams of joining elite sniper units. "Just like to understand how things work," Rachel replied quietly, already studying weather patterns for the mountain region. Marcus laughed. "Understanding and doing are two different things. Wait until you get behind a rifle scope. Theory doesn't mean much when you're trying to hit targets at 800 meters. Rachel almost smiled at that. 800 meters. She'd helped achieve shots at nearly 5 times that distance, calculating wind drift and atmospheric pressure while seasoned snipers took the credit. But she simply nodded and returned to her reading. The next morning brought her first glimpse of the training program's intensity. The long-range shooting course was legendary throughout military circles. Snipers came from across the country to push their limits against the mountain's challenging conditions. The centerpiece was a steel target, positioned exactly 4,010 meters away chilling conditions. The centerpiece was a steel target positioned at an impossible distance, visible only as a tiny speck through the most powerful scopes. "Only legends can hit that far," declared General Patterson, the base commander, as he briefed the latest group of trainees. He was an imposing figure, silver-haired and stern, with ribbons covering half his chest. "We keep that target there for testing purposes only. Don't get delusional thinking you'll ever reach it." Rachel stood in the back of the group, taking notes. Not about shooting techniques, but about wind patterns, humidity changes, and ground stability. The instructors assumed she was documenting procedures for administrative purposes. They had. No idea she was analyzing environmental factors that affected long-range accuracy with the precision of a meteorologist. During the first live fire exercise, she was assigned to equipment duty. While veteran marksmen took turns at various distances, Rachel cleaned rifles, checked scopes, and performed maintenance. But she also watched. Every shot, every miss, every environmental factor that influenced accuracy. She noticed things others missed: how temperature changes affected bullet trajectory, how altitude influenced air density, how microscopic vibrations in the shooting platform could throw off even perfect aim. "Hey, transfer girl," called out Instructor Williams during a break. "Stop daydreaming and get back to work. These rifles won't clean themselves." Rachel nodded politely and continued her tasks. Williams was typical of the instructors here: confident, competent, but limited by conventional thinking. He'd achieved expert ratings through solid fundamentals and good equipment. He'd never had to make impossible shots under impossible conditions. Never had to read atmospheric conditions like a native language because someone's life depended on it. "Don't take it personally," whispered Jenny Rodriguez, one of the few other women at the base. Jenny was a communication specialist who'd befriended Rachel during mess hall meals. "Williams thinks anyone under 6 feet tall shouldn't be allowed near weapons." "It's fine," Rachel replied, though she appreciated Jenny's kindness. "I'm here to learn." But as the days passed, Rachel began to notice patterns that troubled her. Equipment failures that shouldn't happen. Scopes going out of calibration overnight. Rifles developing mysterious accuracy problems. When frustrated, shooters brought their weapons to the maintenance station. It was always Rachel they called to diagnose the issues. She had an uncanny ability to spot problems that stumped experienced technicians. Slight vibrations in rifle actions. Microscopic. Wear patterns on barrel surfaces. Inconsistencies in scope alignment. Skills that seemed supernatural to observers who didn't understand her technical knowledge. How does she do that? Marcus asked Thompson after watching Rachel identify a hairline crack in a scope mount that had been causing wild shots all morning. "Lucky guess," Thompson replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Rachel said nothing. She'd learned these skills through necessity, working with snipers who made shots that pushed the boundaries of physics. When you were responsible for ensuring their equipment functioned perfectly under extreme conditions, you developed an almost mystical understanding of how rifles behaved. Late at night, while others socialized or relaxed, Rachel studied atmospheric data. She tracked how temperature changes affected bullet trajectory, how altitude influenced air density, how humidity created invisible barriers that could deflect projectiles. The other trainees called her antisocial. The instructors labeled her dedicated but limited. Nobody asked about her previous experience. Her transfer paperwork was routine, unremarkable. Former technical assistants seeking specialized training. What they didn't know was that she'd spent 3 years making elite snipers look legendary, providing the technical expertise that turned impossible shots into recorded kills. But regulations were regulations. Without the proper height and physical qualifications, she'd never receive official recognition as a marksman. She was support personnel, invisible and unacknowledged, no matter how critical her contributions might be. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same system that created legends often ignored the people who made those legends possible. But Rachel had made peace with invisibility long ago. Recognition was less important than competence, and competence was something she possessed in abundance. As her first week at Firebase Echo ended, she felt the familiar weight of being underestimated. But she also sensed opportunity. The mountain's challenging conditions, the advanced equipment, the emphasis on extreme range shooting, all of it called to skills she'd developed in shadow. Somewhere in the distance, That impossible target weighed at 4,010 meters. Only legends could hit that far, according to General Patterson. Rachel looked through her window at the mountain peaks and wondered if the general might be wrong about that. After all, legends weren't born. They were made by people nobody noticed, using skills nobody recognized, until the moment when impossible became inevitable. The morning sun burned through the mountain fog as Rachel approached the weapons maintenance station, her notebook tucked under her arm. 3 weeks into her assignment, she'd settled into a routine that kept her invisible, but invaluable. While advanced marksmen practiced at various ranges, she maintained their equipment with an expertise that quietly amazed even veteran technicians. Davis barked Instructor Martinez as he strode toward her station. "We've got a problem with the new batch of rifles. 5 separate weapons showing accuracy issues. Figure out what's wrong." Rachel nodded and began her inspection. Within minutes, she'd identified the source: improperly torqued barrel assemblies from the factory. The fix was simple for someone who understood the microscopic tolerances involved, but it would have taken most technicians hours to diagnose. "How the hell did you spot that so fast?" muttered Staff Sergeant Brooks, watching over her shoulder as she made the adjustments. "Just experience," Rachel replied quietly, not mentioning that she'd seen similar issues dozens of times while supporting elite units. Problems that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, solved by someone whose name never appeared in after-action reports. Experience? Martinez had overheard and approached with a skeptical expression. "You've been here 3 weeks, Davis. Before that, you were pushing paperwork at some backwater northern base. Don't get ahead of yourself." The dismissal stung more than Rachel let show. Martinez wasn't entirely wrong about her official record, but he was completely ignorant about what that record didn't reveal. She'd spent 3 years at that backwater base working alongside Master Sergeant William Kane, a legendary sniper, whose impossible shots had become the stuff of military folklore. Kane had been different from other elite marksmen. While they relied on advanced technology and computer calculations, he trusted environmental reading and intuitive adjustment. Rachel had become his technical partner, the person who calibrated his equipment and calculated atmospheric factors that made his legendary shots possible. "Put the rifles back in service," Martinez continued. "And next time, don't take so long with simple maintenance." Rachel bit back her response. The simple maintenance she'd just performed had corrected manufacturing defects that would have caused dangerous malfunctions. But explaining that would require revealing knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. "Yes, sir," she said instead, returning to her work. Later that afternoon, during advanced marksmanship training, the consequences of underestimation became clear. Marcus Webb was attempting a challenging shot at 1,200 meters, using one of the rifles Rachel had repaired. The target was barely visible through his scope, a silhouette dancing in heat shimmer and crosswinds. "Adjust for wind drift," instructed Sergeant Thompson. "Humidity's high today, so account for drag coefficient changes." Marcus made his adjustments based on the rangefinder's calculations and fired. The shot missed by nearly 2 feet, striking dirt well left of the target. Frustrated, he tried again with similar results. "Must be the scope," Marcus muttered, checking his equipment. Rachel watched from the maintenance station, noting details the instructors missed. The wind wasn't consistent across the entire bullet path. She could see grass moving differently at various distances, indicating complex air currents that simple calculations couldn't account for. The humidity wasn't just high, it was layered, creating invisible barriers that would affect trajectory in unpredictable ways. "Let me check that rifle," she offered quietly. "The rifle's fine," Thompson snapped. "Webb just needs more practice reading conditions." But Rachel had already spotted the real issue. The scope's internal mechanisms were slightly loose, probably from the earlier manufacturing defect she'd corrected. The fix had resolved a major problem, but created a minor one. She could adjust it in seconds, but only if someone listened to her. "Sergeant Thompson," she said carefully, "I think there might be a calibration issue with the scope mounting. I think you need to stick to cleaning guns and let the real instructors handle training." Thompson replied coldly, "When we need maintenance advice, we'll ask for it." Rachel fell silent, watching as Marcus continued to miss shots that should have been routine. The frustration was building in his face, the kind of doubt that could destroy a marksman's confidence permanently. She wanted to help, but the chain of command was clear. Support personnel didn't offer tactical advice. That evening in the mess hall, the conversation at Marcus's table centered on the day's failures. "I don't understand it," he said, picking at his food. "I've made shots like that dozens of times. Today, it was like the rifle was cursed." "Maybe you're just having an off day," suggested Tony Garcia, another trainee. "Happens to everyone." "Or maybe the mountain's messing with your head," added Kevin Murphy. "These conditions are brutal compared to flatland ranges." Rachel sat at a nearby table with Jenny, listening to the conversation while reviewing weather data for the next day's training. She knew exactly what had gone wrong with Marcus's shooting, and she knew how to fix it. But speaking up would violate protocols and likely earn her more hostility from the instructors. "You look like you want to say something," Jenny observed quietly. "It's not my place," Rachel replied, though her conscience was bothering her. Watching a capable marksman struggle with preventable equipment issues felt like a betrayal of everything she'd learned during her years with Kane. "Maybe not officially," Jenny said, "but unofficially? If you can help someone improve, isn't that worth something?" That night, Rachel made a decision that would change everything. She waited until the snow stayed alone. Barracks were quiet, then slipped out to the rifle range. Using her maintenance access, she retrieved Marcus's rifle and performed the delicate scope adjustments she'd wanted to make earlier. It took less than 5 minutes, but the precision required was beyond what most technicians could achieve. She was returning the rifle to storage when footsteps echoed across the range. Instructor Williams emerged from the shadows, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Working late, Davis?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew what she'd been doing. "Just completing some maintenance tasks," Rachel replied carefully. Williams studied her for a long moment. "That's Marcus Webb's rifle, isn't it? The one that was giving him trouble today?" Rachel's heart rate increased, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, sir. I noticed a potential calibration issue during cleaning." "Potential issue?" Williams stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Let me make something very clear, Davis. You are not a marksman. You are not an instructor. You are maintenance personnel, and maintenance personnel do not make unauthorized modifications to training weapons. I was just trying to help." "Help?" Williams interrupted. "You want to help? Then stay in your lane. Clean the rifles, check the inventory, and leave the real work to people who know what they're doing. If I catch you playing with equipment again, you'll be reassigned to kitchen duty faster than you can blink." The thread hung in the air between them. Rachel nodded silently, but inside, anger was building. Williams didn't understand what he'd just dismissed. The unauthorized modification she'd made would improve accuracy by significant margins. Her expertise could help every marksman on the base perform better. But regulations and prejudice were more important than results. "Are we clear?" Williams demanded. "Yes, sir," Rachel replied. But as she returned to the barracks, her mind was already working. Williams represented everything wrong with military bureaucracy, competent enough to maintain the status quo, but too rigid to recognize exceptional capability when it appeared in unexpected forms. He saw her as a threat to established order, not as an asset to be utilized. The next morning brought vindication, though Rachel couldn't enjoy it. Marcus's first shot at 1,200 meters struck the target dead center. His second shot was equally accurate. The rifle performed flawlessly, responding to his input with precision that amazed even the instructors. "Outstanding shooting, Webb," Martinez announced. "Whatever you did differently today, keep doing it." Marcus beamed with pride, unaware that his sudden improvement came from midnight work by someone he barely acknowledged. Rachel watched from her maintenance station, feeling both satisfaction and frustration. She'd helped a fellow soldier improve, but the success would be attributed to everything except her contribution. Williams caught her eye across the range and nodded slightly. The message was clear. This was how things worked at Firebase Echo. Support personnel remained invisible, no matter how critical their contributions might be. But Rachel was beginning to realize that invisibility might be temporary. The base was building towards something significant, and when that moment arrived, she intended to be ready, whether the instructors appreciated her capabilities or not. The mountain winds whispered through the range, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of challenges ahead. In the distance, that impossible target waited at 4,010 meters, a steel reminder of the limits everyone accepted. Everyone, except Rachel Davis, who was beginning to understand that some limits existed only in the minds of those who'd never tried to exceed them. The mountain weather turned hostile in Rachel's fifth week at Firebase Echo. Heavy clouds rolled in from the west, bringing unpredictable winds and temperature swings that challenged even experienced marksmen. It was perfect weather for advanced training, but terrible weather for maintaining equipment. Rachel arrived at the maintenance station to find chaos. Overnight condensation had affected several high-precision rifles, and the humidity was playing havoc with scope calibrations. 3 separate weapons were showing accuracy problems, and the morning's training schedule was backing up as frustrated shooters waited for solutions. "Davis." Martinez's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Get these rifles operational now. We've got VIP observers coming this afternoon, and I won't have equipment failures embarrassing this facility." Rachel nodded and began her diagnostics, working with the focused efficiency that had become her trademark. The problems were complex but solvable. Moisture infiltration in scope housings, thermal expansion affecting barrel harmonics, and atmospheric pressure changes influencing zero calibration. For someone with her background, these were routine challenges. But as she worked, she became aware of whispered conversations among the instructors. Words like show off and overstepping boundaries drifted from their direction. Williams, in particular, seemed agitated by her ability to solve problems that stumped more senior technicians. "She's making us look bad," she heard him mutter to Thompson. A maintenance grunt shouldn't be outperforming certified armorers. "Maybe she's just good at her job," Thompson replied, though his tone was uncertain. "Or maybe she's hiding something," Williams shot back. "Nobody transfers from a backwater assignment and immediately starts performing miracles. I want her background checked thoroughly." Rachel's hands never paused in their work, but her mind was racing. A background check would reveal her official record, which was exactly what it appeared to be: technical assistant with standard qualifications. But it might also prompt questions about why such a junior person had been assigned to work with elite units. Questions that could expose the classified nature of her previous work. The rifles were returned to service just as the first VIP vehicle approached the base. Through the maintenance station window, Rachel watched the convoy of black SUVs navigate the mountain road. General Patterson had mentioned important visitors, but the level of security suggested these weren't ordinary military observers. "Form up for demonstration," Martinez commanded, and the advanced marksmen assembled at the 1,000-meter range. Rachel remained at her station, but she could see everything from her position. The VIP group included Pentagon officials, defense, contractors, and what appeared to be foreign military attaches. The demonstration began routinely enough. Experienced shooters made impressive shots at challenging distances, showcasing the facility's training effectiveness. But as the range extended to 1,500 meters and beyond, problems began to emerge. The atmospheric conditions that had plagued equipment all morning were equally challenging for marksmanship. Wind patterns were chaotic, humidity was creating. Optical distortions and temperature gradients were affecting bullet trajectories in unpredictable ways. Even skilled marksmen were struggling to maintain accuracy. Rachel watched with growing concern as shot after shot missed the intended targets. The VIPs were taking notes, their expressions increasingly skeptical. This was supposed to be a showcase of American military marksmanship excellence, but it was turning into an embarrassing display of environmental limitations. "This is a disaster," Jenny whispered, joining Rachel at the maintenance station window. "Those Pentagon people are going to think our training program is incompetent." Rachel said nothing, but her analytical mind was working furiously. She could see patterns in the misses that revealed the environmental factors affecting each shot. Wind velocity was varying dramatically at different altitudes along the bullet path. Temperature layers were creating invisible barriers that deflected projectiles. The shooters were using standard calculations that couldn't account for such complex atmospheric conditions. "Davis," Williams appeared beside her, his voice tight with stress. "Check every rifle again. Make sure there are no equipment issues causing these misses." "The rifles are functioning perfectly," Rachel replied quietly. "The problem isn't mechanical." "Then what is it?" Williams demanded. "These are expert marksmen. They don't just start missing routine shots." Rachel hesitated. Explaining what she observed would require revealing knowledge that went far beyond her supposed experience level. But watching American military capability being questioned by foreign observers was painful beyond endurance. "The atmospheric conditions are extremely challenging," she said carefully. "Multiple wind layers, temperature gradients, humidity variations. Standard calculation methods might not be sufficient." Williams stared at her incredulously. "Are you seriously suggesting that our certified instructors don't know how to read weather conditions?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Rachel replied. "I'm just observing that the environmental factors are more complex than usual." "Observing," Williams repeated mockingly. "Right. A maintenance technician is going to teach expert marksmen about atmospheric conditions. Stay in your lane, Davis." But as the demonstration continued, the problems only worsened. A Navy SEAL instructor missed a target at 1,800 meters by more than 3 feet. An Army Ranger veteran struggled to hit anything beyond 2,000 meters. The VIPs were whispering among themselves, clearly unimpressed by what they were witnessing. Rachel felt physically ill watching the display. These were capable marksmen being defeated by conditions she could read and compensate for. But protocol demanded she remain silent while American military reputation suffered. "This is painful to watch," Jenny murmured. "Is there anything you can do?" "Not without violating direct orders," Rachel replied, though every instinct screamed at her to intervene. The breaking point came when Martinez himself took position for a demonstration shot at 2,500 meters. As head instructor, his performance would either salvage the demonstration or confirm the VIP's worst impressions. The target was challenging, but achievable for someone of his caliber under normal conditions. Rachel could see immediately that he was making the same mistake as the others, relying on calculated adjustments instead of reading the actual environmental conditions. The wind wasn't consistent, the humidity was layered, and thermal effects were creating invisible currents. That would push his bullet significantly off course. Martinez fired. The shot missed by nearly 4 feet, striking ground well left of the target. The silence that followed was deafening. Several VIPs shook their heads in disappointment. One of the foreign attaches made notes with obvious satisfaction. "Equipment malfunction," Martinez announced, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll investigate and reschedule the demonstration." But Rachel could see in his eyes that he knew the rifle was functioning perfectly. The problem was human, not mechanical, and that made it infinitely more embarrassing. As the VIP group departed, their unimpressed expressions spoke volumes about the demonstration's impact. Rachel remained at her station, watching American military prestige drive away in black SUVs, while she possessed the knowledge that could have prevented the disaster. That evening, the mood in the mess hall was somber. Word of the failed demonstration had spread throughout the base, and morale was suffering. The instructors sat apart from the trainees, their usual confidence replaced by defensive frustration. "I don't understand what happened out there," Marcus said to his tablemates. "Martinez is one of the best shooters I've ever seen. He shouldn't miss shots like that." "Maybe the equipment really was malfunctioning," Tony suggested hopefully. "Or maybe the conditions were just impossible," Kevin added. "Some days the mountain wins." Rachel listened to the speculation while reviewing weather data from the demonstration. The conditions had been challenging but not impossible. She'd seen Kane make similar shots under worse circumstances, using techniques that most modern marksmen had forgotten in their reliance on technology. "You look like you have thoughts about today," Jenny observed quietly. "Everyone has thoughts about today," Rachel replied, but she was thinking about something Kane had told her once. "The best marksmen don't fight the environment. They dance with it." When you stop calculating and start feeling, impossible shots become inevitable. That night, Rachel made a decision that would define the rest of her time at Firebase Echo. She couldn't directly challenge the instructors or violate the chain of command, but she could prepare for the moment when her knowledge might be desperately needed. She began developing detailed environmental analysis techniques specifically adapted to the mountain's unique conditions, not to share with anyone, but to be ready if opportunity arose. Because she was beginning to suspect that Firebase Echo was building towards something much more significant than routine training. And when that moment came, she intended to be ready to prove that legends weren't born from regulations and protocol. They were forged by people who understood that expertise couldn't be confined by rank or recognition. The storm that had been building over Firebase Echo finally broke on a gray morning in Rachel's 7th week. She arrived at the maintenance station to find Instructor Williams waiting with a folder in his hands and an expression that promised trouble. "Davis," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss your performance." Rachel set down her equipment bag and faced him calmly. "Is there a problem with my work, sir?" Williams opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be official documentation. "That depends on how you define your work. According to multiple reports, you've been making unauthorized modifications to training weapons, providing unsolicited tactical advice, and generally overstepping your assigned duties." "I've been performing maintenance as requested," Rachel replied carefully. "If specific procedures weren't appropriate, I'd appreciate clarification." "Clarification?" Williams's voice rose slightly. "How about this for clarification? Your maintenance personnel. Your job is to clean rifles and check inventory. It is not to redesign scope calibrations, adjust barrel harmonics, or whatever other technical wizardry you've been performing." Rachel felt the familiar weight of being misunderstood settling on her shoulders. "The modifications I've made were necessary to correct manufacturing defects and environmental factors that affected accuracy. Every change was documented and improved weapon performance." Improve performance, Williams repeated mockingly. Right. A maintenance grunt with basic technical training is going to improve weapons that certified armorers have already approved for service. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of General Patterson, who strode into the maintenance area with obvious purpose. His expression was grim, and Rachel noticed he was carrying a classified folder marked with security stamps she recognized from her previous assignment. "Williams," the general said curtly, "I need to speak with Davis privately." Williams looked surprised but nodded and left the area. Rachel remained at attention, uncertain what to expect but sensing that something significant was about to change. General Patterson studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I've been reviewing your personnel file, Davis. Interesting reading." "Yes, sir," Rachel replied, though she wondered exactly what version of her file the general had accessed. "Your previous commanding officer, Colonel Bradley, had some very specific things to say about your capabilities. Things that don't quite match your official job description." Rachel's pulse quickened. Colonel Bradley had overseen her work with Kane and the other elite snipers. If he'd been contacted, it meant someone was digging deeper than routine background checks. He mentioned, the general continued, that you were instrumental in achieving several long-range shooting records at your previous assignment. Records that required, and I quote, extraordinary technical expertise and atmospheric analysis capabilities. The words hung in the air between them. Rachel remained silent, uncertain how much the general knew or suspected. He also mentioned, Patterson added, that regulatory limitations prevented official recognition of your contributions. Something about height requirements and classification protocols? Now Rachel understood. Her background was being exposed, but in a way that might actually help rather than hurt her position. "Yes, sir. I worked as technical support for advanced marksmanship training." "Technical support," the general repeated. "That's an interesting way to describe what Colonel Bradley called the most gifted ballistics intuitive he'd encountered in 30 years of service." The revelation hit Rachel like a physical blow. Bradley had never told her he held such a high opinion of her capabilities. During their 3 years working together, he'd been professional but distant, rarely acknowledging her contributions beyond routine performance evaluations. "Sir, let me finish," Patterson interrupted. "Yesterday's demonstration was an embarrassment to this facility and to American military capability. Experienced marksmen missing routine shots while foreign observers took notes. It was unacceptable." Rachel nodded, remembering her frustration at watching preventable failures unfold. "What makes it even more unacceptable," the general continued, "is the possibility that we had someone on base who could have prevented those failures, but who was being wasted on equipment maintenance because nobody bothered to look beyond her official job description." The implication was clear, but Rachel wasn't sure how to respond. Admitting her capabilities would confirm that she'd been concealing relevant experience. Denying them would perpetuate the misunderstanding that was limiting her contribution. "I have relevant experience in environmental analysis for long-range marksmanship," she said carefully. "But I understand my current assignment and have been fulfilling those duties to the best of my ability." Patterson nodded approvingly. Diplomatic answer. "But diplomacy isn't what we need right now." He opened his classified folder and withdrew several documents. "We're planning something that will make yesterday's demonstration look like basic training. A test that will either restore confidence in American marksmanship capability or confirm our critics' worst assumptions about our decline." Rachel waited, sensing that something momentous was about to be revealed. "The Honor Long Range Challenge," Patterson announced. "One shot, maximum distance, under the most challenging conditions we can create. The target you've probably noticed at 4,010 meters." Rachel's breath caught. She'd observed that distant target many times, calculating the atmospheric factors that would affect such an extreme shot. It was beyond the range most marksmen could even attempt. "We're inviting the same VIP group back in 2 weeks," the general continued, "along with international observers, defense contractors, and military leadership from 5 allied nations. 1 demonstration shot at maximum range, with full telemetry and verification." "Who will be taking the shot?" Rachel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's the question," Patterson replied grimly. "Martinez is our most experienced instructor, but yesterday's performance has shaken his confidence. The other qualified marksmen are equally affected by the demonstration failure. We need someone who can make an impossible shot under impossible pressure." Rachel said nothing, but her mind was already analyzing the challenge. 4,010 meters in mountain conditions with international observers witnessing every detail. The atmospheric factors alone would be staggering. Multiple wind layers, temperature gradients, humidity variations, and thermal effects that standard calculations couldn't account for. "There's something else," the general added. "Intelligence suggests that one of our foreign allies is planning to document our failure for propaganda purposes. They want to demonstrate that American military technology and training are inferior to their own capabilities." The stakes were becoming clear. This wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about national prestige and military reputation on an international stage. "I want you to work with Martinez on environmental analysis for the shot," Patterson commanded. "Use whatever expertise you've been hiding to help him succeed. This is bigger than protocols or job descriptions." Rachel felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief that her capabilities were finally being recognized, anxiety about the enormous pressure, and anger that it had taken a crisis to reveal what should have been obvious from the beginning. "I'll do everything I can to help," she said quietly. "Good," Patterson replied. "But understand this. Failure is not an option. American military credibility is on the line. If we can't make this shot, our enemies will use that failure for years to come." As the general left, Rachel remained at her station, staring out at the distant target that had suddenly become the center of her world. 4,010 meters of mountain air, filled with invisible challenges that could deflect even perfect aim. But for the first time since arriving at Firebase Echo, she felt something approaching hope. Not because the challenge was easy, but because someone finally understood that she possessed the knowledge necessary to meet it. The question wasn't whether the shot could be made. Kane had taught her that any shot was possible with sufficient understanding of environmental conditions. The question was whether Martinez could execute techniques that required abandoning conventional methodology in favor of intuitive atmospheric reading. That night, Rachel began the most intensive preparation of her career. Not for her own performance, but to transfer knowledge that might determine America's reputation in the eyes of the world. She had 2 weeks to teach Martinez what had taken her 3 years to learn. 2 weeks to turn an impossible shot into an inevitable one. The mountain winds seemed to whisper approval as she worked, as if nature itself understood that something significant was about to unfold. Something that would prove legends weren't born from equipment or regulations, but from the marriage of human expertise and environmental understanding. Rachel Davis was about to discover whether her years of invisible contribution had prepared her for the moment when invisibility was no longer an option. Rachel's first training session with Martinez began at dawn the next morning, away from the main range where other instructors couldn't observe. The general had made it clear that her involvement was to remain unofficial until after the demonstration. Too many egos were at stake to admit that a maintenance technician was providing tactical guidance to the base's senior instructor. "Let's get something straight," Martinez said as they approached the shooting position. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I don't need basic marksmanship lessons from someone who's never held a sniper qualification. Rachel nodded respectfully. I understand, sir. I'm here to provide environmental analysis support, not shooting instruction. Good, Martinez replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced this arrangement would work. Show me what you think you know about atmospheric conditions. Rachel had spent the previous night preparing for this moment. She'd analyzed weather patterns for the past month, studying how mountain conditions affected long-range ballistics. Her notebook contained detailed observations about wind layers, temperature gradients, and humidity variations that most marksmen never considered. The key challenge at 4,010 meters isn't distance, she began carefully. It's the atmospheric complexity between here and the target. Standard ballistic calculators assume consistent conditions along the bullet path, but that assumption breaks down at extreme ranges. Martinez looked skeptical, but gestured for her to continue. Wind velocity varies significantly at different altitudes, Rachel explained, pointing toward the distant target. What we feel here at the firing position might be completely different. 500 meters downrange, and different again at 2,000 meters. I know about wind reading, Martinez interrupted. Every marksman learns to observe grass movement and adjust accordingly. Yes, sir, Rachel agreed, but grass only shows surface wind. At extreme range, we need to read atmospheric layers that aren't visible from ground level. She opened her notebook and showed Martinez diagrams she'd created during her years with Kane. Complex charts showing how temperature differentials created invisible air currents, how humidity formed barriers that could deflect bullets, how thermal effects from sun-warmed slopes created updrafts and downdrafts along the bullet's path. Martinez studied the diagrams with growing interest. Where did you learn this level of atmospheric analysis? Rachel chose her words carefully. Previous assignment involved supporting advanced marksmanship training. I worked with instructors who specialized in extreme range shots. Instructors like who? Martinez pressed. Master Sergeant William Kane. Rachel replied, watching Martinez's expression change immediately. Kane? Martinez's voice carried new respect. You worked with Billy Kane? He's legendary. Nobody's ever matched his long-range records. I provided technical support for his training program. Rachel confirmed, not mentioning that she'd been the person who made those legendary records possible. Martinez's entire demeanor shifted. If she'd worked with Kane, her credentials were unquestionable. Kane's reputation in the sniper community was beyond dispute, and anyone he trusted for technical support must possess exceptional capabilities. What did Kane teach you about environmental reading? Martinez asked, his previous skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Rachel felt a moment of emotional pain remembering her mentor. Kane had died in a training accident 6 months after her transfer, taking with him knowledge that existed nowhere else in the military. His techniques had died with him, except for what he taught her during their 3 years together. He taught me that environmental conditions aren't obstacles to overcome, she said quietly. They're information to be read and utilized. When you stop fighting the atmosphere and start dancing with it, impossible shots become predictable. Dancing with it, Martinez repeated. That sounds like Kane. He always said marksmanship was more art than science at extreme ranges. Rachel nodded. He believed that technology could only take you so far. Beyond 2,000 meters, success depends on intuitive understanding of how air moves and changes. Over the following days, Rachel began sharing techniques that hadn't been documented in any manual. Methods Kane had developed through decades of experience, refined through thousands of shots under impossible conditions. She taught Martinez to read thermal shimmer patterns that revealed air density changes. She showed him how to interpret cloud formations that indicated high-altitude wind patterns. She explained how to feel atmospheric pressure changes that affected bullet trajectory. "This is incredible," Martinez admitted after a week of intensive training. "I've been shooting for 15 years, and I'm learning things I never knew existed." But as their sessions continued, Rachel began to notice a troubling pattern. Martinez was absorbing the theoretical knowledge quickly, but translating it into practical application was proving difficult. The intuitive aspects that came naturally to her remained foreign to his methodical, technology-dependent approach. "I understand what you're telling me," he said during one particularly frustrating session. "But when I'm behind the scope, I keep reverting to calculated adjustments instead of feeling the conditions." Rachel watched him struggle with growing concern. Martinez was a skilled marksman using conventional methods, but extreme-range shooting required abandoning conventional thinking. It demanded the kind of environmental intuition that took years to develop, and they had less than a week remaining. "Maybe we need to approach this differently," she suggested. "Instead of trying to change your entire methodology, what if we combined your technical skills with environmental analysis?" "How do you mean?" Rachel had been considering this possibility since their training began. "What if I served as your spotter for the demonstration? I could provide real-time environmental analysis while you focused on execution." Martinez looked intrigued but uncertain. "Spotters are usually qualified marksmen themselves. You don't have official sniper training." "No," Rachel agreed. "But I have 3 years of experience reading atmospheric conditions for extreme-range shots." Kane's spotters were always qualified snipers, but I was the one who provided environmental analysis that made his impossible shots possible. The admission hung between them. Rachel had just revealed more about her previous role than she'd intended, but desperation was overriding caution. "You were Kane's environmental analyst?" Martinez asked with growing amazement. "The person who calculated conditions for his record shots?" Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of secrets finally being acknowledged. Official records credit him with those achievements, and rightfully so. He was the one who pulled the triggers. But the environmental analysis that made those shots possible came from techniques we developed together. Martinez stared at her with new understanding. "That's why your atmospheric knowledge is so advanced. You weren't just supporting advanced training. You were enabling legendary achievements." "I was part of a team," Rachel corrected. "Kane was the legend. I just helped him understand what the air was doing." But even as she spoke, Rachel was beginning to realize something that would change everything. Martinez was a competent marksman, but he wasn't Kane. He didn't possess the intuitive brilliance that had made Kane legendary, and no amount of training could create that kind of natural ability. The demonstration was in 5 days and international. Observers would be watching America's military capability through the scope of a single rifle. If Martinez failed, the consequences would extend far beyond personal embarrassment. That night, alone in her quarters, Rachel faced a possibility that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. What if the shot couldn't be made by Martinez, regardless of her environmental support? What if the only way to succeed was for someone with true atmospheric intuition to take the shot themselves? The regulations were clear about who could participate in official demonstrations. She didn't have the height requirements, the physical qualifications, or the sniper certification necessary for such a role. But she had something more important: the knowledge and instinct necessary to make an impossible shot under impossible conditions. As mountain winds whispered through her window, Rachel began to consider a course of action that would either save American military prestige or end her career in disgrace. Sometimes the most important battles were fought by people nobody expected to fight them. And sometimes legends emerged from the shadows where they'd been hiding all along. The morning of the Honor Long-Range Challenge dawned gray and turbulent, with mountain winds that made Rachel's heart sink. She arrived at the range 2 hours before the scheduled demonstration to find Martinez already there, staring through his scope at the distant target with visible anxiety. "How are the conditions?" she asked, though she could already see the challenges they faced. "Terrible," Martinez replied grimly. "Crosswinds, temperature gradients, humidity variations. Everything we trained for, but worse." Rachel studied the environmental factors with growing concern. Grass at different distances swayed in conflicting directions, indicating complex wind patterns. Heat shimmer created optical distortions that would make target acquisition difficult. Cloud formations suggested high-altitude air currents that would affect the bullet's path unpredictably. "We can work with these conditions," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Remember what we practiced about reading thermal layers." But as the VIP convoy arrived, Rachel sensed that Martinez's nervousness was approaching panic. The international observers included military attaches from 6 nations, Pentagon officials, and defense contractors whose opinions would influence future funding decisions. The pressure was enormous, and Martinez was visibly struggling under its weight. General Patterson approached their position as the observation area filled with dignitaries. "How are we looking?" he asked quietly. "Challenging conditions," Rachel replied diplomatically, "but manageable with proper analysis." Patterson nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely reassured. "Martinez, you ready for this?" "Yes, sir," Martinez answered, though his voice lacked conviction. As the formal presentation began, Rachel positioned herself beside Martinez's shooting platform with her environmental analysis equipment. She'd spent the previous week developing techniques for providing real-time atmospheric data during extreme-range shots, methods that went far beyond standard spotting procedures. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Patterson announced to the assembled observers, "today's demonstration represents the pinnacle of American long-range marksmanship capability. The target is positioned at 4,010 meters, a distance that challenges the limits of both human skill and ballistic science." Rachel felt the weight of international attention focusing on their position. Through her scope, she could see foreign military officers taking detailed notes, clearly hoping to document American failure for their own purposes. "Instructor Martinez will be making the attempt," Patterson continued, "with environmental analysis support from our technical specialist." Several observers looked in Rachel's direction with obvious skepticism. Her small stature and civilian-style clothing didn't match their expectations for military marksmanship support personnel. "Wind analysis," Rachel whispered to Martinez as he settled into shooting position. "Surface wind from the northwest at 8 miles per hour, but there's a thermal gradient at 1,500 meters creating crosscurrents." Martinez nodded and made his initial adjustments, but Rachel could see tension in his body language that would affect his accuracy. The pressure of international observation was overwhelming his training. "Humidity barrier at 2,500 meters," she continued, reading atmospheric conditions that were invisible to everyone else present. "Adjust elevation 2 minutes of angle to compensate for air density changes." Martinez made the correction, but his movements were mechanical, rather than intuitive. He was following her instructions rather than feeling the environmental conditions himself, creating a dangerous disconnect between analysis and execution. "Take your time," Rachel advised. "The conditions are complex but readable. Trust the environmental data." But as Martinez prepared for his shot, Rachel noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the foreign observers had produced a high-end camera with a telephoto lens, positioning himself to document the shooting position in detail. If Martinez missed, the photograph would be used for propaganda purposes worldwide. "Thermal updraft from the south slope," she whispered urgently. "Adjust windage 1 minute left to compensate." Martinez made the adjustment and fired. The bullet's flight time at extreme range seemed eternal. For nearly 10 seconds, everyone watched and waited while the projectile traveled through 4,000 meters of turbulent mountain air. Rachel held her breath, calculating trajectory factors in her mind, knowing that dozens of variables could cause failure. The radio crackled with spotting information. No impact observed. Repeat, no impact on target. Silence fell over the observation area like a funeral shroud. Martinez had missed completely, his bullet disappearing into the mountainside beyond. The target. The failure was total and public, witnessed by international observers who were already making notes about American military inadequacy. Equipment malfunction, General Patterson announced quickly, though everyone present knew the rifle had functioned perfectly. Rachel felt physically sick watching American prestige crumble in real time. Foreign officers were smiling with satisfaction, having witnessed exactly what they'd hoped to see. Defense contractors were shaking their heads, questioning investments in American marksmanship programs. Second attempt authorized, Patterson declared. No regulations typically allowed. Only one demonstration shot. But Rachel could see that Martinez was devastated by the miss. His confidence was shattered, his hands were shaking, and his breathing was irregular. A second attempt under these conditions would likely be even worse than the first. "I can't do this," Martinez whispered to her. "The pressure is too much. I'm second-guessing every adjustment." Rachel looked at the assembled observers, at the cameras documenting American failure, at the foreign attaches who would carry news of this disaster back to their governments. Everything she'd worked for, everything Kane had taught her, was being discredited because regulations prevented the right person from taking the shot. "Sir," she said quietly to General Patterson as he approached their position, "I need to speak with you privately." Patterson looked confused but followed her away from the shooting platform. "What is it, Davis?" "Martinez can't make this shot," she said bluntly. "He's a skilled marksman, but not under this level of pressure with these atmospheric conditions." "Are you suggesting we cancel the demonstration?" Patterson asked incredulously. "No, sir," Rachel replied, her heart pounding with the audacity of what she was about to propose. "I'm suggesting that someone else should take the shot." "Someone else? Who?" "Martinez is our most qualified instructor." Rachel took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either save the demonstration or end her military career. Someone who has the environmental analysis capability necessary to make this shot without a spotter. Patterson stared at her with growing understanding. "You're talking about yourself." "Yes, sir," Rachel confirmed. "I know the regulations about height requirements and sniper qualifications. But I also know that American military credibility is being destroyed while we have someone present who can make this shot." "Davis, you're not qualified for—" "Sir," Rachel interrupted, "I've been making shots like this possible for 3 years. The only difference is that now I'm asking to pull the trigger myself instead of telling someone else how to do it." "General." Patterson looked toward the observation area, where foreign officers were clearly enjoying American embarrassment. His jaw tightened as he weighed regulations against results, protocol against national prestige. "If you miss," he said quietly, "this becomes an even bigger disaster. A maintenance technician failing after a senior instructor already failed." "If I miss," Rachel replied, "we're no worse off than we are now. But if I hit, we demonstrate that American military capability extends beyond conventional expectations." Patterson studied her face for a long moment, searching for confidence or competence that regulations said shouldn't exist. What he saw there apparently convinced him that desperate times required desperate measures. "One shot," he said finally. "If you miss, I'll take full responsibility for the decision. If you hit, the credit goes to innovative training methods and environmental analysis techniques." Rachel nodded, understanding that success would be attributed to institutional capability. while failure would be blamed on individual incompetence. But personal recognition had never been her motivation. "I'll need 12 minutes to analyze current conditions and make equipment adjustments," she said. "Take whatever time you need," Patterson replied. "At this point, we have nothing left to lose." As Rachel returned to the shooting platform, she felt the weight of international attention shifting to her small frame. Foreign observers were whispering among themselves, clearly amused that a maintenance technician was attempting what an experienced instructor had failed to achieve. But Rachel was no longer thinking about observers or consequences. She was entering the mental state Cain had taught her, where external pressure disappeared and only environmental conditions mattered. The mountain was speaking to her through wind patterns and thermal currents, and she was ready to listen. 4,010 meters of turbulent air lay between her and a target that would determine American military reputation for years to come. But for the first time since arriving at Firebase Echo, Rachel felt completely at peace. She was finally in her element. Rachel approached the massive Snipex rifle with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. The international observers watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright mockery as the small maintenance technician prepared to attempt what their experienced instructor had failed to achieve. "This should be interesting," she heard one of the foreign attaches mutter in accented English. "Americans so desperate they're using support personnel for marksmanship demonstrations." Rachel ignored the commentary and began her environmental analysis. This wasn't about proving herself to skeptical observers. It was about reading 4,000 meters of mountain atmosphere with the precision necessary to make an impossible shot inevitable. She started by studying grass movement at various distances, noting how vegetation swayed differently at specific ranges. The wind wasn't consistent. It rarely was at extreme distances, but it was readable. Surface winds from the northwest at 8 miles per hour. Thermal currents from the sun-warmed south slope creating crosswinds at 1,500 meters, and high-altitude patterns indicated by cloud movement suggesting downdrafts beyond 3,000 meters. "What is she doing?" one of the Pentagon officials asked General Patterson. "Environmental analysis," Patterson replied, though his own understanding of Rachel's methods was limited. "Calculating atmospheric factors that affect long-range ballistics." Rachel pulled out a pencil and began making marks on the rifle barrel, calculations that drew amazed stares from observers accustomed to sophisticated electronic equipment. Temperature gradients, humidity variations, barometric pressure changes, all translated into precise mathematical adjustments using techniques Cain had taught her years ago. "She's using manual calculations," a defense contractor observed with obvious skepticism. "No laser rangefinder, no ballistic computer, no atmospheric sensors. This is primitive methodology." But Rachel was operating on a level beyond their comprehension. The electronic equipment they considered essential was designed for standard conditions and predictable environments. Mountain shooting at extreme range required understanding nuances that computers couldn't quantify. The way thermal layers created invisible barriers, how humidity formed pockets of dense air that could deflect bullets, how microscopic pressure changes affected trajectory in ways that equations couldn't capture. 12 minutes passed as she studied conditions with the intensity of a scientist examining a complex equation. Every blade of grass, every thermal shimmer, every cloud formation provided data about atmospheric behavior along the bullet's path. "Wind speed varies at different altitudes," she murmured to herself, making final calculations. "Temperature gradient creates density barriers at 2,500 meters. Humidity forms a deflection zone at 3,200 meters. Thermal updraft from the south slope affects trajectory after 3,000 meters." The observers exchanged glances. clearly uncertain whether they were witnessing expertise or elaborate pretense. Several foreign officers were taking detailed notes, apparently planning to document American military desperation for intelligence purposes. Rachel settled into shooting position, adjusting the rifle's massive scope with minute precision. At 4,010 meters, the target was barely visible, even with maximum magnification. A steel plate that appeared as little more than a distant speck through atmospheric distortion. "No spotter," observed one of the military attaches. "This is highly irregular procedure." "She doesn't need a spotter," Martinez said quietly, speaking for the first time since his failed attempt. "She's reading conditions that most of us can't even see." Rachel's breathing settled into the controlled rhythm Kane had taught her. Heartbeat steady, muscle tension minimal, mental focus absolute. The external pressure of international observation faded away as she entered the meditative state necessary for extreme-range shooting. Through her scope, she could see heat shimmer distorting the target image. Crosswinds at multiple altitudes would push the bullet in different directions during its 9-second flight time. Humidity would create drag coefficients that changed along the trajectory. Temperature variations would affect air density in ways that standard calculations couldn't predict. But Rachel wasn't relying on standard calculations. She was using intuitive understanding developed through 3 years of making impossible shots possible for Kane. Environmental reading that transcended mathematics. Atmospheric awareness that operated below conscious thought. She made final scope adjustments based on conditions only she could perceive. Wind drift, compensation for crosscurrents at 1,700 meters. Elevation correction for thermal barriers at 2,800 meters. Windage adjustment for high altitude. Downdrafts beyond 3,000 meters. The rifle settled into perfect stability as Rachel prepared for the shot that would determine American military credibility in the eyes of the world. 4,010 meters of turbulent mountain air lay between her position and a target that would either validate her expertise or confirm every skeptic's worst assumptions. "Impossible conditions," muttered one of the foreign observers. "No one can make accurate calculations with so many atmospheric variables." But Rachel had stopped calculating. She was feeling the environment with senses developed through years of patient observation. The mountain was speaking to her through thermal currents and pressure changes, and she was listening with the focused attention Kane had taught her was essential for legendary shots. 12 seconds of final environmental assessment. Wind patterns were stabilizing into readable configurations. Temperature gradients were creating predictable deflection zones. Humidity barriers were forming consistent density changes that could be compensated for with precise adjustments. Rachel squeezed the trigger with the gentle pressure Kane had drilled into her muscle memory. The rifle fired with controlled recoil, sending its projectile on a 9-second journey through hostile atmospheric conditions toward a target that represented American military reputation. The bullet's flight time at extreme range created an eternity of silence. Foreign observers watched through binoculars, clearly expecting to document another American failure. Pentagon officials held their breath, knowing that careers and budgets depended on the next few seconds. Defense contractors calculated the cost of continued investment in marksmanship programs that might be fundamentally flawed. 9 seconds felt like 9 hours as the projectile traveled through multiple wind layers, temperature gradients, and humidity variations that would challenge even perfect calculations. Rachel remained motionless behind the scope, her mind tracking the bullets. Probable path through atmospheric conditions she'd analyzed with methodical precision. Then the radio crackled with verification. Target struck. Repeat. Target struck center mass. Hit confirmed at 4,010 meters. Complete silence followed the announcement. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, as the impossible became reality. The maintenance technician had achieved what the experienced instructor could not. Using manual calculations and environmental analysis techniques that seemed primitive compared to modern technology. The electronic display showed the confirmed distance, 4,010 meters. The bullet had traveled nearly 2.5 miles through turbulent mountain air to strike a target. Most observers couldn't even see clearly through their binoculars. General Patterson was the first to speak. "Outstanding shot, Davis. Absolutely outstanding." But Rachel simply stood up, safed the weapon, and stepped back without celebration or emotional reaction. The shot had been successful because the environmental analysis was accurate, not because of individual heroics. She'd simply applied techniques Kane had taught her to conditions she understood better than anyone else present. The foreign observers who'd arrived hoping to document American failure now found themselves witnessing a demonstration of capability that exceeded their own military standards. The defense contractors who'd questioned marksmanship program investments were suddenly taking notes about environmental analysis techniques they'd never considered. "How did she make those calculations without electronic assistance?" asked one of the Pentagon officials. "Experience," Martinez replied, his voice filled with new respect. "She's been doing environmental analysis for extreme-range shots longer than most of us have been shooting." As word of the successful shot spread throughout Firebase Echo, the true magnitude of what had occurred began to sink in. A maintenance technician had broken the base record by over 200 meters, using methods that challenged conventional understanding of long-range marksmanship. But Rachel was already thinking beyond the demonstration. The shot had been successful. American military credibility had been preserved, and techniques Kane had developed were finally receiving recognition they deserved. Her personal vindication was less important than proving that human expertise could exceed technological limitations when properly applied. The mountain winds carried the scent of pine and the promise of storms ahead. But Rachel no longer feared atmospheric challenges. She had just proven that legends weren't created by equipment or regulations, but by people who understood that excellence emerged from the marriage of human intuition and environmental awareness. The impossible shot had become inevitable, just as Kane had always promised it would. The transformation at Firebase Echo began immediately after Rachel's shot, but it wasn't the kind of change she had expected. Within hours, her personnel file was being reviewed by Pentagon officials, and by the next morning, military sniper schools from across the country were requesting copies of her environmental analysis techniques. General Patterson summoned her to his office 3 days after the demonstration, where she found him reviewing a stack of official communications that seemed to grow larger each hour. "Davis," he began, "I've received formal requests from 7 different military installations asking for your transfer to their advanced marksmanship programs. The Defense Department wants to incorporate your environmental analysis methods into standard sniper training curricula, and 3 foreign militaries have inquired about training exchanges to study your techniques." Rachel sat quietly, unsurprised by the attention, but uncertain how to respond to it. Recognition had never been her goal. Competence had always been sufficient. "There's also this," Patterson continued, sliding a folder across his desk. "Recommendation for immediate promotion to sergeant, with assignment to the Advanced Marksmanship Research Division at Fort Benning. Full recognition of your specialized expertise, official sniper qualification waiver, and research budget for developing environmental analysis protocols." Rachel opened the folder and scanned documents that would transform her from invisible support personnel to officially recognized specialist. Everything she'd worked toward for years, validated by a single impossible shot. "And if I prefer to remain here?" she asked quietly. Patterson looked surprised. "Davis, this is a career-making opportunity. You'd be working with the militaries. Most elite marksmanship programs, developing techniques that could revolutionize long-range shooting training. I understand the significance, Rachel replied, but I'm more interested in individual instruction than institutional development. What she didn't say was that fame and recognition felt foreign after years of deliberate invisibility. The technique she'd used came from Kane's teaching, refined through patient observation and dedicated practice. Turning them into bureaucratic training protocols seemed like a betrayal of their essential nature. At least consider the offers, Patterson urged. Your expertise is too valuable to waste on routine maintenance duties. Rachel nodded politely, but her mind was already made. She'd proven her capabilities to herself and demonstrated that American military marksmanship remained world-class. Personal advancement was less important than continuing the work Kane had started. Over the following weeks, the myth of her record shot grew beyond anything she could have anticipated. Military publications described her as the maintenance technician who redefined extreme-range marksmanship. Defense contractors studied her manual calculation methods, trying to incorporate human environmental intuition into electronic systems. Foreign observers who'd hoped to document American failure instead found themselves requesting information about training techniques they couldn't replicate. But the most meaningful recognition came from the trainees at Firebase Echo, who began seeking her guidance with genuine respect instead of dismissive tolerance. Marcus Webb approached her during equipment maintenance one morning, his previous swagger replaced by humble curiosity. "Rachel," he said, using her first name for the first time since her arrival, "would you be willing to teach me some of your environmental reading techniques? I keep thinking about that shot, and I realize I don't understand the first thing about atmospheric analysis." "Of course," she replied, pleased that someone wanted to learn rather than simply benefit from her expertise. Jenny Rodriguez joined them, having requested transfer to the advanced marksmanship program specifically to study under Rachel's guidance. "I've been documenting your ground reading and wind analysis methods," she said. "Would you mind reviewing my notes to make sure I'm understanding the principles correctly?" As word spread, Rachel found herself teaching informal classes to small groups of interested trainees. Not formal instruction that would violate protocols, but mentorship sessions that focused on environmental awareness and atmospheric understanding. Students who'd struggled with conventional methods discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed when they learned to read conditions instead of calculating them. The most significant change occurred among the instructors themselves. Williams, who'd been her harshest critic, approached her with unexpected humility 3 weeks after the demonstration. "Davis," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about your capabilities, and my skepticism nearly cost us a critical demonstration. I'd like to learn from you, if you're willing to teach." Rachel nodded, appreciating the courage it had taken for him to admit his mistake. Everyone learns at their own pace. What matters is being open to new methods when conventional approaches aren't sufficient. Martinez became her strongest advocate, crediting her with teaching him environmental awareness techniques that had improved his own shooting dramatically. "She made me understand that marksmanship at extreme range is more about reading conditions than operating equipment," he told anyone who would listen. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in an unexpected form. 6 months after the demonstration, Rachel received a letter forwarded through military channels. The return address showed it was from Kane's widow, whom she'd never met, but who had somehow learned about the record shot. "Dear Rachel," the letter began, "I wanted you to know how proud William would be of your achievement. He often spoke about the technical specialist who made his impossible shots possible, though he never mentioned your name due to classification requirements. He said you understood atmospheric conditions better than anyone he'd ever worked with. and that your expertise would someday receive the recognition it deserved. I'm glad that day has finally come." The letter continued with personal details about Kane's final months, including his regret that military regulations had prevented official acknowledgement of Rachel's contributions. He said the greatest marksmen were often invisible, the letter concluded, but that invisibility didn't diminish their importance. "Thank you for carrying on his work." Rachel read the letter 3 times, feeling emotions she'd suppressed for years finally finding expression. Kane had recognized her value, even when she doubted it herself, and his confidence in her abilities had ultimately proven justified. A year after the demonstration, Firebase Echo had become the military's premier environmental marksmanship training facility. Students came from around the world to study techniques that emphasized human intuition over technological dependence. The base's reputation for producing exceptional marksmen was built on principles Rachel had introduced, though she insisted on remaining officially unofficial in her teaching role. "Why don't you accept formal recognition?" Jenny asked during one of their evening conversations. "You've revolutionized how the military approaches long-range shooting." "Because formal recognition changes the nature of the work," Rachel replied. "When expertise becomes institutional, it often loses the personal connection that makes it effective. I'd rather remain available for individual instruction than become part of a bureaucratic training system." The distant target at 4,010 meters remained in place, though it was no longer considered impossible. Several students had achieved hits at that range using techniques Rachel had taught them, proving that her methods could be transferred to others with sufficient dedication. But Rachel's greatest satisfaction came from watching formerly struggling marksmen discover their own capabilities through environmental awareness training. Students who'd been ready to quit advanced programs found new confidence when they learned to trust their observational skills instead of relying solely on technological assistance. Late one evening, as mountain winds whispered through her quarters, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible support personnel to reluctant legend. The record shot had validated her expertise, but more importantly, it had created opportunities to share knowledge that might otherwise have died with Kane. She thought about the students who would carry these techniques to new assignments, spreading environmental awareness throughout military marksmanship communities. The expertise that had once existed only in classified programs was now becoming standard training, ensuring that future generations of marksmen would understand the marriage of human intuition and atmospheric science. True excellence, Rachel had learned, wasn't measured in personal achievements or official recognition. It was found in the capabilities she developed in others, the confidence she helped them discover, and the skills they would pass on long after her own career ended. The mountain held its secrets close, but it also shared them with those patient enough to listen. Rachel had learned to speak its language, and now she was teaching others to hear its voice. In a world increasingly dependent on technology, she was proof that human expertise remained irreplaceable when properly developed and applied. Some legends wore uniforms covered with ribbons and medals. Others wore simple windbreakers and carried basic pencils. Both changed the world in meaningful ways, but only one asked for nothing in return, except the opportunity to perfect skills that saved lives when conventional methods failed. As sleep approached, Rachel smiled at the irony of her situation. She'd spent years being underestimated because she didn't fit anyone's idea of what a marksman should look like. Now she was training people who would achieve their own impossible shots using techniques she developed in shadow. The greatest achievements, she understood now, often came from people nobody noticed until the critical moment when everything depended on them. And the most important victories were measured not in personal glory, but in the quiet satisfaction of excellence shared with those ready to receive it. Win doesn't demand gratitude, she thought, remembering her own words from months earlier. It just needs someone listening carefully. That was the essential lesson Cain had taught her, and the wisdom she would continue sharing with anyone willing to learn. Outside her window, the mountain peaks stood silent against the star-filled sky, keeping watch over a base where impossible had become inevitable through the patient application of human expertise. And somewhere in the darkness, that distant target waited for the next student ready to discover that legends weren't born from equipment or regulations, but from the courage to trust capabilities others couldn't see. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.